When Jesus lived on earth in human form, he was picked apart. Every little detail of his life was examined by those around him, specifically the religious leaders of his time. He was forever under the microscope, so to speak, of those all around him. God must have known that Jesus would be under the scrutiny for thousands of years. God knew that God and Jesus in human form would be continually inspected and deconstructed and studied and restudied for years and years. I grew up in a church, so all of the Bible stories are very familiar to me. At least the stories in the Bible that were selected to be part of the rotating group of Bible stories. I have tried to pull out the stories in the Bible that really are not the ones people talk about. In my book, Deep and Wide, I try to pull out stories that are often overlooked. Another book that I wrote that came out last fall was a collection of stories, people telling their stories. And while I was interviewing Dr. Bobby Glass, just as we were talking about particular instances and stories in the Bible, we ended up talking about something that she was sharing that brought light to part of the Easter story that has always evaded me. Something I had just completely looked over. So for about the last year, this has continually been on my mind. And I have these thoughts that have been percolating. And I want to share some of those thoughts with you today. And so for me, this is an Easter message that's hidden in plain view. An Easter message that's hidden in plain view. You know, Jesus was continually picked apart. God knew that Jesus would be under a microscope forever and continues to be today. And for some reason, all these years, I missed this particular part of the Easter story. Perhaps you have missed this part of the story as well. And I want to start by reading to you from Matthew chapter 26, verses 17 and 19. And my primary Bible of choice is the New International Version, the 1986 version. I don't care for the 2011, so I don't use it at all. But this is one of the passages that I want us to start with this evening. Matthew 26, 17 through 19. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He replied, he being Jesus, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him blah, blah, blah." So Matthew records this as Jesus sending them in to find a certain man. As is my practice, when I'm studying the Bible, I have three primary texts that I use. The 1986 International Version, the Living Bible, which is a paraphrase from the 70s, and the Message, which is a paraphrase from today. One of these, the Message also said, this reads as Jesus telling them to go find a certain man, a particular man. Not just any man, there was a particular man he wanted them to find. The Living Bible tells them to go find Mr. So-and-so. The Living Bible makes it sound like they're going to the owner of the house, but both the Message and the New International Version lead us to believe that this is someone who is either a servant or a slave or works for a particular man. So there was a certain man they were sent to go see. Now, as is my tradition and my practice, when I am looking at something in one of the Gospels, I always search out to see if it is also recorded in the others. As it turns out, this is recorded in 3 of the Gospels, not John. And it's kind of interesting. Matthew and John were there with Jesus. They were each one of the 12 disciples. Mark was considered one of the 70 apostles of Jesus when you get outside of that group of 12. Mark was probably a teenager when Jesus still walked on earth. May have been around Jesus some as a teenager. It's really not clear. A lot of Mark's gospel comes from the retellings of events from Peter. Peter shared a lot with Mark. So a lot of what we read in the book of Mark comes from the retellings from Peter. Mark also was an evangelist who worked alongside of Paul at some point, and then also worked independently of Paul as well. The book of Luke never met Jesus. Luke never met Jesus. Luke, I want to say he was a disciple of Paul, but he was a convert of Paul's. He was associated with Paul in ministry. Luke is one who never met Jesus. Mark may have. Luke did not. And actually, Paul never met Jesus as well. Paul did, however, meet and spent some time with Peter. So it's interesting that the Gospel of Mark is heavily influenced by the recollections and retellings of Peter. Paul's knowledge of Jesus also was heavily influenced by Peter. Now, in the Bible, we also find that Paul had conversations with James. Now, it is believed that Paul's interactions with James was actually 2 people named James. Remember, there are 2 disciples named James. James, James, the brother of John, is one of them, and another James. There actually is a 3rd James that appears throughout the New Testament and actually wrote the books of James, and that would be James, who would have been a half-brother to Jesus. And so it was Jesus's actual brother on earth. Had the same parents, it's the same earthly parents as Jesus. And from what I've read and studied, I believe that Paul actually had conversations with James, the actual brother of Jesus, and James the disciple James that was the brother of John. And so a lot of Paul's information or firsthand eyewitness accounts come from Peter and James, the brother of John, and James, the actual brother of Jesus. Okay? All right, so I started with Matthew, and if I have to pick in the Gospels here, Matthew and John were there with Jesus for the bulk of his ministry. And so in Matthew chapter 26, verse 18, where Matthew records the actual words of Jesus telling them to go into the city to a certain man. There's a particular man I want you to find. I wish Matthew would have expanded on that in the way that Peter did when Peter shared with Mark, and must have been the way Peter shared with Paul so that Paul could share that with Luke. And so let's go to Mark. Mark chapter 14, verses 12 and 16. And Mark may have been there in and around at that time. We often think of the Last Supper being Jesus and just the 12 disciples. We really know that Jesus had some female disciples as well. It's not recorded that way because the position of women historically and culturally at that time, they weren't included in such things, but I honestly believe Jesus did have some female disciples as well. It talks about Jesus in the upper room with the 12, but they didn't count the women. So it could have been the 12 disciples and some others, you know. Jesus spent time with children. Mark was a child / teenager, a youth. He could have been around at this time as well. But anyway, so that's really not the important of what I want to draw out of this today. So Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 16. On the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent 2 of his disciples, telling them. I'm not sure which 2 he sent. In my mind, I'm thinking James and Peter, or James and John, or for sure, I think it probably was Peter, because Peter is the one who shared these stories in great detail with Mark, and then Peter would have been the ones who shared them with Paul, who shared them with Luke. So 2 disciples. In my mind, I think it was John and Peter, or James and Peter. And I kind of go with Peter and James. I don't have anything to back that up other than just my thought. And this is what Jesus said. "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him." Let me read that again. "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters." There's some clues there. To the owner of the house. So the man carrying the water is not the man who owns the house. The Living Bible kind of makes it sound that way, but I don't believe that's the truth. So we're not talking about a poor man. There's a man who owns a house, who has servants, slaves, people working for him. They go and fetch the water. He doesn't go and get his own water. His family doesn't go and get the water if he has a family. So he's a man of means. Has a nice house. He has guest rooms in his house. And that's what they're inquiring about. A guest room that Jesus may use to have the Passover meal with his disciples. Okay? So are you getting the picture here? The disciples are sent to the town to find a man carrying water and follow him where he goes. And when he gets to the house he's going to, the disciples are to ask the owner of that house if Jesus and his disciples can use his guest suite or guest rooms to have the Passover meal together. Okay, it's important for us to realize that these aren't poor. This is not a poor man's house. Anyway, that's my belief in this take from this. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead and I want to read the same thing from Mark in the Living Bible. I always like to read in a couple of places. So, and we're reading in Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 16. "As you are walking along," he told them, this is Jesus telling this to disciples, "as you're walking along, you will see a man coming towards you carrying a pot of water. Follow him. At the house he enters, tell the man in charge, 'Our master sent us where we will Our master sent us to see the room you have ready for us, where we will eat the Passover supper this evening. He will then take you upstairs to a large room, all set up. Prepare our supper there. Okay? I want to read that in the Message as well. He had directed 2 of his disciples, go into the city. A man carrying a water jug will meet you. Follow him. Ask the owner of whichever house he enters. And they're sending them to find this place. They're sending them to find this place where they can gather together for the Passover meal, which we now talk about as the Lord's Supper. In, I think it's 1 Corinthians, where Paul kind of talks about this a little bit. And actually, Paul kind of takes this event of Jesus with the disciples and turns it into a ritual that might be slightly more than what Jesus actually had intended. I want us to focus back on what these 2 disciples were told by Jesus to do. Go into the town. Look for the man carrying water and follow him. Follow him to the house where he's taking the water. When you get to that house, ask the owner of the house for the guest room or guest suite for them to use, for Jesus to meet with his disciples. I want to jump ahead to another story. And this comes from the 4th chapter of John. A Samaritan woman who was the first person that Jesus shared who he really was. He shared with this woman that he was indeed the Messiah. He was indeed he. He was the one that they were waiting for. It's interesting. Much of the stories we hear told and retold is about Jesus has come to the special group of people, the Jews. I don't believe God is a God of discrimination now, and I don't believe God was a God of discrimination then. I think God came for all people, and I think the very message, model, and life that Jesus lived proved that exact point. When Jesus revealed who he really was, other than to his disciples, the first person he told publicly was a Samaritan woman. The Samaritans and the Jews were enemies just by culture. I wouldn't really call it race and ethnicity, but in our minds, when we're thinking about divisions that strong, in our world, it's race and ethnicity. So kind of put that hat on to help us understand what's going on here. Now, it says in the Bible that Jesus was there in the heat of the day, the hottest part. I think it says during the 6th hour. We count time after midnight. That's not the way they did it then. If we were talking about the 6th hour, it'd be like the 6th hour after the sun come up. The sun comes up, that's the new day, okay? It's not midnight like we think of now. So the sun had been up 6 hours. It would have been hot. The women at that time went to get water early in the morning while it was still cool. Did you hear what I said? The women went to get water early so that there was the water that they needed in the house and for everyone who lived in the house. It was women's work. The women did that. Gender roles were very specific then. Gender roles are still pretty specific in some areas in our world today, but they were even more specific and stringent back then. So why was this Samaritan woman there in the hot part of the day and not the early part of the day? Well, this particular Samaritan woman, we find later in the story where Jesus tells her all about her life without her having to tell him. She'd been married 5 times, and she was living with a man at that time that she was not married to. So I believe she was going to get water at a time when no one else would be at the well. I have a feeling people were not nice to her. She was a bad girl. She'd been married and divorced 5 times. Well, divorced 4 times, married 5 times, and now living with somebody else who was not even her 5th husband. She was shunned by the people. You know, there are some people in our modern society today that are shunned by the people of the church. So the concept of this lady going to get water in the middle of the day was so no one else would be there. So Jesus sent 2 disciples into the town to look for the man carrying water. Men did not carry the water. And in this story, they were to follow this man back to the house so they could speak to the owner of the house. So this man carrying the water was a servant carrying out the duties of a woman. That must have been extremely rare, because they're going to this town and they're looking for a man carrying water, and it's not like there's going to be a lot of them. And if there was a man who needed to carry water for some reason, they would go at a time where they would not be seen, because they would not want to be seen as a man performing the duties of a woman. There's a lot of hang-ups with this today. The hang-ups with this back then would have been more severe. I really can't find a contemporary example of this, but this is what thought came to my mind. If I need to hire some day laborers, it's pretty common in Houston, if you need day laborers, sometimes people to build fences, people to paint. If you go to any Home Depot in town, it's probably true of Lowe's as well, but the Home Depots around here, you go by there early in the morning, 8 or 9, there will be people gathered there in their work boots. They'll have their hammers, some of them have their tools, and they're ready to work. So you can come and say, hey, I need 3 people to paint today. Hey, I need 3 people to weed and edge and put in mulch, and you can get your day laborers there. I need someone who can build a fence. The 2 disciples were sent to find the man carrying water. That must have been as unusual as me saying, I'm going to the Home Depot parking lot and looking for some day laborers, and I'm looking for the woman who's there with her pickup truck and her work boots. I assume there are women that do that kind of work. In fact, I know there are women who enjoy that kind of work and are good at that kind of work. But I will say, I have never seen a woman hanging out in that group of men there on the side of Home Depot looking to get work for the day. I've never seen it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I've never seen it. So when the 2 disciples are sent to the city to find the man carrying a jug of water, that was rare. Jesus sent them to find the man who was living life doing women's work. This wasn't a poor man who had no wives and no daughters and no female servants to do all the woman's work, like collecting the water. This is not a man who's going to get his own water because he's all by himself. Because Jesus told them, find the man carrying the water and go back to the house where he goes and ask the owner of the house. So this is a man doing women's work who works for someone else. I'm sharing some of my thoughts with this story, but I'm going to fall short of making my point. Because I think you're making the point in your head right now. And the point that I am inferring can't be proven, but there's something unusual in this story. That's why I called this an Easter message hidden in plain view. Now, some of the hang-ups we have with men behaving as women or living life in female roles or females living in male roles. Again, I'm being vague on purpose, and I'm avoiding specific terms because at the time of the story, those terms did not exist. But that does not mean that those people did not exist. There just wasn't terminology for it. One of the scriptures that I've heard today used against people today that are the born males living as female or the born females living as male. There's a Hebrew law, and it comes in all but one of those 146 abominations stated in the Bible that states that it'd be an abomination for a man to wear a woman's clothing. And I've heard that misused today, and let me explain why it's misused today. The people 4,000 years ago, when all of those Hebrew 146 rules were written, they didn't go to Macy's to buy their clothes. They didn't go into the women's department and see the female clothes. They did not go into the men's department and see the male clothes. They didn't shop at Macy's. Actually, if you look at the clothing, the cloaks, the tunics, the draping over the head for both men and women. Now, they had some different rules about that for going in the temple, but the clothing itself was not different. An article of clothing that was made for a man would be identical to the article of clothing that was made for the women. The male clothing and the female clothing was the same. So why was there a rule about it being an abomination for a man to wear a woman's clothing? It wasn't that it was a female style of clothing or a male style of clothing. It wasn't the difference between a dress and pants. An article of clothing only became women's clothing when it was worn by a woman. Then it belongs to that woman. That'd be like if I went to Macy's and I bought a full-length sequin dress and came and hung it in my closet, it would belong to me. So it would be a man's dress because I bought it, it belongs to me. Okay? So this rule about a man not wearing a woman's clothing was really about the ownership of the garment. Let me explain why. Blood and touching dead things and touching things that bled was an abomination. You had to go through a purification rites. It was an abomination for a man to wear clothing of a woman because it likely had blood on it, woman's blood, which meant it was unclean, and then the man became defiled because of the blood. It had nothing to do with style of clothing. So using those Old Testament scripture today against someone based on what clothing they wear is ridiculous. You know, I could care less what people wear. Jesus sent 2 disciples into the city to find the man carrying carrying water and follow him back to the house where he went. And then talk to the owner of the house about a guest suite or a guest room, an upper room that Jesus and his disciples could use to share the Passover meal together. I guess it's possible that this man carrying the water probably did other chores around the house. This man could have been in the upper room with Jesus and the disciples, perhaps helping with the food, perhaps making sure that they were comfortable, keeping the candles lit. Perhaps this man was doing other chores around the house that would be typical of a woman. I can't just take this story by itself and not think about everything else Jesus did by living his life on earth in a way that pointed out the hypocrisy of the people, revealing himself as the Christ first to a Samaritan woman, and a cultural enemy of the people that were looking for the Messiah. Although the Samaritans were also looking for the Messiah. So that is the story that I wanted to bring to light today. I have spent the last several years looking through the Bible and looking for stories that go deeper and wider than our typical Sunday school encounters. And so when I think of this Passover meal or the Last Supper with Jesus sharing with his disciples, this year I celebrate this with a new lens with which to look. And the new lens that I have to look at is through the lens of gender and gender roles. And I'm not making this all up. It would have been unusual for a man carrying a jar of water. And it wasn't like it was an emergency. This was a man who worked for someone who had enough to have servants do the work for the house. So the man of this house knew he had someone working for him who was doing the chores of a woman. You know, when we do communion, we talk about the fruit of the vine or the grape juice and the bread. That's a lot what people ate at that time. But you know, they probably had nuts and pomegranates and cheeses. They had other things that they were eating. And Jesus talked with his disciples, and he wanted to pull a metaphor from the last time that they ate together as a group. Jesus was good about metaphors and parables. And I like metaphors, I really do. And so Jesus knew that his time on earth in human form was coming to an end. And so, you know, they probably had nuts and berries and figs and other things to eat, cheeses. But he on purpose picked two of the most common elements. And I kind of, you know, from my Christian traditions, communion was like maybe 4 times a year. Always at Easter, always at Christmas, often on New Year's Eve, if there was a New Year's Eve service, and then another random time. It was special. When I started going to one of the churches that I attend regularly now, they have communion every single Sunday. And at first I thought, what is this? You know, I was feeling like it was robbing me of some of the specialness of it. But when I go back to what Jesus was doing, he on purpose picked very common elements. So this is something they would do all the time. Every time they ate bread and drank fruit of the vine, juice, every time he wanted them to remember something that he had taught them. You know, and he taught them that in the metaphor, the bread represented his body. And his body was about to be broken. And every time they ate bread, tore off a piece of bread, he wanted them to remember that his body was broken. I think a lot of times we talk about Jesus being the sacrifice, but I think we downplay that Jesus was murdered by the religious leaders who worked through the Romans to make it happen. So when I think about the body of Jesus being broken, I think about him being murdered by the religious institutions that worked within the system to get it done. And so he told them that every time they had bread, to remember that. Remember that Jesus, God in human forms, had his life cut short, taken. He was murdered because he challenged the status quo. Talking to a Samaritan woman challenged the status quo. Eating in the house of tax collectors challenged the status quo. Finding a man carrying water challenged the status quo. Having his last meal together with his disciples in the home of a man who hired at least one man, maybe more than one, to work in female roles. Or hired a man who preferred to work and live in a female role. Maybe. And we were asked to remember that every time we had bread. So when I deconstruct my own religious practices over the years, communion 4 times a year, can you imagine if I only had bread 4 times a year? I don't think that was the intent. The juice of the fruit of the vine, in this case, grapes, was their livelihood. Their water wasn't always healthy to drink, so this is what they drank. Can you imagine if you only, this was important to people back then as water is to us today. Everything we drink is made with water. In fact, the juice that I prepared today is actually from concentrate. So I had to actually add 3 parts water to 1 part of the juice concentrate. Can you imagine if we only had water 4 times a year? So in preparing for this conversation with you tonight, I've really had to deconstruct my own practices of communion. And and taking it more often shouldn't lessen its meaning. It should deepen it. Although in actual practice, I don't see it that way. But Jesus on purpose picked the two most common elements of the table, the bread and the drink. He didn't pick figs and cheese and say, whenever you eat this cheese or whenever you eat this fig. No. He picked a solid and a liquid. And he said, whenever you drink this drink, remember me. It's interesting that he also talked about blood, because to those people, blood was like the worst thing. You weren't supposed to touch it. A woman was ceremonially unclean once a month. If a woman gave birth to a boy baby, she couldn't even go in the church for so many days. If she gave birth to a girl baby, she was even more unclean and she had to stay away from the church longer. So it's interesting that Jesus, in his metaphor, related the life liquid. I mean, we can't live without water. So without liquid, we can't live. And without blood, the body can't live. So it's interesting that he said, as often as you drink of the cup, remember me. So this Easter, as we go through this week, I'm recording this for you on a Monday. Yesterday was Palm Sunday. I have an Easter noon concert to go to on Wednesday and Thursday. I have 2 Good Friday services to go to on Friday. I don't know which I'm going to yet. And Sunday I have 2 services because I actually go to 2 churches. And I am to the point where I'm considering both of them my churches. I have my 8:30 church and I have my 11 o'clock church. And I will be at both of those for Easter Sunday. But I have a new Easter story this year that I didn't have before. And I'm calling this An Easter Message Hidden in Plain View. An Easter message hidden in plain view. Jesus sent 2 of his disciples into the city to find the man carrying water, something that men didn't do. But they found the man carrying the water and followed him back to the house where he worked, either as a servant or a slave, we don't know. So he worked for someone in the role of a woman, but was a man. So, this Easter, when I take communion on Sunday, I'll think not only of the body of Jesus that was murdered and the blood of Jesus that was spilt, but I will remember Jesus specifically this Easter and for a long time, maybe forever, as God in human form that came to challenge and call people out for their religious hypocrisy. We're told that in heaven there is neither male nor female. So gender must not be important in the eyes of God. People are people. Skin color is irrelevant. Social standing is irrelevant. I wanted to leave you today with a song. And the song I wanted to share with you is verse 1 and 4 of a hymn. It's called Open My Eyes That I May See. It was written by Clara Scott. Verse 1. Open my eyes that I may see. Glimpses of truth thou hast for me. Place in my hands the wonderful key that shall unclasp and set me free. Verse 4. Open my mind that I may read more of thy love in word and deed. What shall I fear while yet thou dost lead? Only for light from thee I plead. Silently now I wait for thee, ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my eyes, open my mind, illumine me, Spirit divine.